Chapter 7. A Different Point of View. Whatever course you decide upon, there is always someone to tell you that you are wrong. There are always difficulties arising which tempt you to believe that your critics are right. To map out a course of action and follow it to an end requires courage. Ralph Waldo Emerson. A small boy and a dog crossed a field under a black blanket of sky, scattered with pinpricks of starlight and crescent-slit moon. It was the kind of darkness only possible in a place many miles from street lamps and passing cars. Though my dog Duke and I had barely enough light to see where we were going, we knew the way. I was only 5, but every day my dog and I walked nearly a half-mile to feed 500 chickens. In a family that raised fowl for a living in rural Washington state, my duty was to come straight home from kindergarten and head for the coops. On this day, the temptation to join the other kids on the playground after school had been too great. When I finally returned home, it was dark. My mother gave me a long look and said nothing. While I was washing my hands for dinner, my father came home from his job at the feed mill. Calmly, my mother informed my father the chickens had not been fed. Turning to me, my father said in a tone not unkind but firm, "Son, you have to feed those chickens right now." As I took my jacket off the hook by the door, my father disappeared into the bedroom to change his coveralls, and my mother turned back to the soup bubbling on the stove. I stepped outside and picked up the flashlight lying on the work table under the eaves of the house. Duke appeared at my side. I looked into the inky sky and swallowed hard. I clicked the flashlight on, pointed its thin beam forward, and began walking. The darkness turned hedges into gargoyles. Rustling squirrels became monsters' footsteps. Duke's panting was the only familiar sound in this alien landscape. After what felt like the longest walk of my life, Duke and I reached the coops, and I made quick work of feeding the chickens. Then we set off on the frightening trek back to the farmhouse. When we arrived, Duke slipped off to the barn, and I went into the kitchen. My father was sitting at the table, my mother ladling the soup into his bowl. "I got the chickens fed, Dad," I said. My father nodded an indication for me to wash my hands and come to the table. My father and I never talked about that night, not even after I grew into an adult who could question being sent alone on such a walk at the age of 5. I remember I learned a lesson that night about responsibility. What you owe your family when you have duties, you don't shirk them. My father had always dreamed of owning his own chicken farm. When I was a year old, our family moved from Iowa to Washington, and our family bought a farm that was a boy's paradise. 24 acres of pasture, hills, trees, and a sprawling house. To supplement our farming income, my parents took jobs they considered temporary to tide us over until the chicken business grew sufficiently. But by the time I was 5, the dream had failed, and our family was forced to put the farm up for sale. I hid the for sale signs in the woods, thinking it would stop the transaction. It didn't. My mother's brother, Bernard Hamilton, offered our penniless family employment at Fairfax Hospital, a psychiatric sanitarium he and his wife Marion owned near Seattle. In addition, he let us stay in a tiny house on the grounds. At night, my brother and I slept on 2 small beds in one room, while our parents slept on a fold-out sofa in another. My father was a maintenance man at the sanitarium, my mother an aide and cook. They also began raising chickens on contract in coops scattered throughout the region. As a first grader, I was responsible for 3,000 chickens, the number doubling by the time I was in 3rd grade. 4 years later, when my father was often too ill to work, our flock grew to 45,000 chickens. Decades later, it wasn't the poultry I remember. I can still close my eyes and sense the sting in my nose and throat from waste piled 3 feet high in the chicken houses. I can remember the ache in my shoulders and back from hauling tons of the smelly matter out of the coops in a wheelbarrow during seasonal cleanings. The failure of the family farm hung over my father, and anxiety seared ulcers into his stomach. There were still many days he couldn't get out of bed for work. So when I was 15, I took a job at the sanitarium to help care for the animals, work in the gardens, and generally help out. Later, I also served as a companion for the patients. My aunt and uncle believed that productive work was important in the treatment of a wide variety of psychiatric disorders. As such, I often asked patients to work with me while I went about my duties at the hospital. It was not unusual for me to drive the hospital's truck to the feed store with a 30-year-old man with suicidal tendencies sitting next to me. When I received orders to wax the hospital's first floor, my helpmate was an heir to an old New England family. He was under treatment for explosive rages. I had never been formally trained regarding patient care. The staff assumed I would figure it out, and I did. Adopting a nonchalant and friendly tone, I would invite my teammates to help me out with some stuff today. I learned the art of watching without being noticed and of discerning unvoiced thoughts, desires, and anger. Later, I would say, if you could understand what the patients were saying with their eyes and body language, you could anticipate what they were about to do, even if they didn't say a word. Always busy, I added to my load by starting a veal business with several classmates. I also found time for school sports. Despite my family's troubles with money and my father's poor health, my parents encouraged my athletics from Little League through college. I played football, baseball, and basketball, and I was especially drawn to running track. As I neared adulthood, I was sprinting in other ways. I was going to make something of myself. For a long time, I thought I would be a cattle rancher. Throwing myself into this endeavor, I worked hard during summers at a nearby ranch and immersed myself in anything I could read on the subject. By the end of high school, however, farmers in the area were struggling to survive. An ominous harbinger for even the most ambitious rancher. I read that starting a cattle ranch required a $500,000 investment. No matter how many hours I worked at various jobs, reaching that amount appeared impossible. When my uncle suggested using his experience at the sanitarium as the basis for a career as a psychiatric hospital administrator, I followed his advice. I pursued a business degree, first at a community college, and then at the University of Washington, all the while working as many as 40 hours a week at Fairfax Hospital. Further, I bought out my friend's interest in the veal business and shouldered the entire workload, and started raising purebred Black Angus cattle. When I was a junior at the university in 1972, my aunt and uncle, the Hambletons, retired selling Fairfax Hospital to CPC, Community Psychiatric Centers, a company that operated psychiatric hospitals in several states. A variety of corporate brass with the firm visited Fairfax Hospital during the transition to the new ownership. I had the job of picking up the executives at the airport. At the wheel one day, I told the CEO that I planned a career in psychiatric hospital administration. The CEO offered me a position as assistant administrator at one of its California hospitals when I graduated. A year later, I arrived at CPC's headquarters for the administration training program, when a vice president emerged from a corner office and told me I was being sent to the purchasing department. I refused to be reassigned. After a tense standoff, the executive yielded, and I joined the training program alongside two new hires who were 15 years older and had previous administration experience. Several weeks into the course, I was given the job. The other two could not keep up with me. I was only 22 years old, fresh-faced and lean. Many made the mistake of assuming I was the overgrown kid I appeared to be. However, after 6 months as an assistant administrator, I was promoted to an administrator position at a larger CPC hospital. There I was tested in an environment riddled with operational and procedural problems. I took the helm and the problems were resolved. Because of my success in that environment, I was dispatched to lead the CPC hospitals with the worst records: patient numbers falling, staff members ignoring procedures, and adolescent patients out of control. Invariably, I turned the facilities around. At first, hospital staff would doubt me, I said years later, but I've always had the gift of a command presence. When I was growing up, I did well with bulls. When you have a big animal like that, you need to be able to handle it, or it's going to handle you. Once I got the cooperation of the staff, they began to understand how my methods worked. People who knew me during my career at CPC would describe me tactfully as probably more hard-nosed and aggressive in my focus than I am now. Likely, those hospital staffers never met anyone who worked the way I did. I grew up never having a day off. It was no different now when I took on a new hospital. I slept there most nights before relocating my family to the area. I lived alongside the patients, the same way I had at Fairfax Hospital. Schizophrenics, the profoundly depressed, the phobia-ridden, they were my fellow residents. So were elders with ebbing memories and unpredictable moods. I never considered that psychiatric patients were anything other than human beings who happened to have illnesses of the mind. My purpose in living among them went beyond bringing the hospital in line with CPC's rulebook. I was there to raise the facility to the best level of care. I did not stop running during my years with CPC. Once I fixed the problem assigned to me, filling the time with more work was natural. I developed new programs in marketing and patient care and attended independent study graduate programs in hospital administration at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. I studied the intricacies of Canada's healthcare system. At the University of Minnesota, I taught myself the ins and outs of property acquisition and hospital development. All the while, I was pushing CPC's brass to expand the company. Ultimately, I charged all the way to the top of the corporate ladder and became president and chief operating officer of CPC's worldwide operations. When I first joined CPC, the firm had 6 mental health hospitals. By the end of my 20-year tenure, it was operating 50 psychiatric hospitals, over 100 renal dialysis units, and a subacute medical surgical hospital business. Newly married in my early 20s when I began, I was a father in my early 40s when I left CPC in 1993. Asked why I walked away from the top post at a successful company, I explained the psychiatric industry was changing. Due to the influence of some less than ethical operators, managed care was given free rein to reduce costs, which in large part was done by denying care. I called it the 1-800-JUST-SAY-NO line. I believe the trend would not alter. While I was proud of CPC's operations, I didn't want to be part of the industry anymore. Doing nothing was unthinkable for the man who had worked every day since childhood. I couldn't shut the door and walk away from those I had assisted, befriended, and lived with for so long, and I realized that one group needed me the most. They were the people with Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Parkinson's, and other conditions that robbed memory. I understood that psychiatric hospitals weren't the right place for them. They were not mentally ill. They had diseases of the brain that produced symptoms which at times appeared to be psychiatric in nature, but were actually biological. With rare exceptions, their conditions followed 6 or 7 robust decades of building families, careers, and friendships. Then they lost everything they loved, and the world became an alien place. When my own father needed care in his later years from a non-operable brain tumor which caused severe dementia-like symptoms, grim hospitals and nursing homes were still his only option. Every experience in my life had built up to this moment. After years at CPC, I was prepared to risk everything I had to save these people.